Why now? Why did you choose to write this memoir now? And, what was your experience writing? Is this your first book that you've written?
Yes, it's my first book. I hope it's not my last, but who knows?
Sounds
I
like you got plenty of stories, so hopefully not.
Sorry, hopefully not. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
you got plenty of stories to tell, so.
Lots of stories. I the first thing I did when I stopped working in television a few years ago was thought about what I wanted to do, and I always wanted to. I always liked writing. And my wife said, "Hey, Sarah Lawrence Institute, Writing Institute, is down the street. You can basically go take some classes there." So I thought, well, that sounds like fun, maybe. And it turns out it was. And I took classes in memoir. So I wrote a lot of stories about my childhood, some of which ended up in the book. And when I say a lot, I mean, I'm talking like 200,000 words worth of stories about my childhood. But then one day I think I wrote the story that you read, the Eddie Gorodetsky story about him saying, "What do you know about?" And I read that to the class, and they were like, "Wow, we didn't know you had anything to do with comedy. That's cool, why don't you tell some more stories like that?" So I did, and that's how it started. And then after a while, I realized, wow, this was a great adventure of mine,
Yeah.
and I should probably tell it so that people understand what went on in those days and where comedy came from, and maybe they can have a better appreciation for it all. And
Yeah.
that's how it happened.
Well, it was extremely, extremely well written for this being your first book. It was very entertaining from front to back.
Oh, thank you.
And I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed like a lot of flashbacks kind of in between while we'd be having a conversation and you'll flashback to like an older, you know, something that happened in your younger age that kind of applies to what was going on now. And I guess my question was this intentionally written like a movie or a show? Because it really has that kind of cadence and feel of a movie.
Well, I think my storytelling style is probably influenced by movies and television, given that, I was steeped in that for so long. I also, uh, I didn't write it linearly. As I said, I wrote a story here, a story there. But then when I started to sit down and talk about, to myself mostly, about how to tell the story, I wanted to make it exciting.
Yeah.
And, nobody does that better than the movies or television because they got to end a scene where the audience wants to see what happens in the next scene. They don't want you to turn off the TV or walk out of the theater. So I think that's the way I went at it. And people have told me, maybe I shouldn't say this, but because it was very flattering, people have told me that it's kind of a page turner, like you want to find out what happens. And that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted it to be, something that you could read and would be like a thriller, like what's going to happen to this guy? What's going to happen? Is the channel going to happen? Is he going to keep his job? Is Bill Maher going to get him fired? What's going to happen? And I like hearing that, that, and I laughed out loud a lot. And those are my two favorite compliments on this book.
Those both apply definitely. And was there any hesitation when you were like writing about your peers or revealing kind of your personal thoughts and perspectives about situations that people you around wouldn't have known until you wrote about it, basically?
Yeah, I would say there was massive hesitation, as in mortal fear. When I first started writing memoir in these classes, it got talked about a lot. Like, oh my gosh, I'm writing a story about my mother, someone would say, and if she reads this, she'll hate me forever. And we talk about that. And at the end of the day, you realize that the great writers, whether they're memoirists or novelists, because so much in novel is based on people's real lives or real people, that when you become a writer, you just got to cross that line. You just got to learn that you're gonna tell things about yourself and about other people that you wouldn't necessarily think of doing. And the first experience is you're telling it to a small group of people in a class or a writer's group. And that is hard, but then they sort of know you and they're sort of starting to like you. And okay, so they're telling crazy stories too about their families or friends or whatever. So you're all like in this little bubble and you're sharing. But then you start thinking about, okay, I'm writing a book about real people who don't come off great in this book. And they might read it. And in fact, I think they have read it in some cases. And I just said, there's a great quote, and unfortunately I won't get it completely right, but there's a great quote by a writer, which is something like, look, if you're writing a memoir and somebody comes up to you and says, boy, you really depicted me in a nasty way, you should say to them, well, listen, if you wanted to be depicted more nicely in my memoir, you should have been nicer.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, even, I think most people in my book come off pretty well. There are a couple of people who don't, but I don't take them apart as much as tell the story.
Yeah.
So you make up your own mind. I don't say that guy was a jerk. I say, here's what happened. And yes, it looks like the guy was a jerk. So you say the guy was a jerk. But I think that memoirs or stories where they do say, my boss was an asshole, for example, and I think that's sort of unnecessary. But there are lots of memoirists who do that too, who really just say, I was mistreated by the following people and I am going to take them to task for it. And I hope they suffer as a consequence. I will say this too. As much as it's hard to write about people in kind of a negative way, and they're not going to come off well. And as I said, there's only a couple of people I think in the book, I don't know if you agree with me, who don't come off so great.
Yeah, there's only maybe 3 that don't come out in the best light. Not horrible, but not great.
Yeah, right. So it's also hard to write about people you worked with and loved and cared about and were friends with and thought were great, who went on to greatness, for example. And there were plenty of those in the book. And you start, I started thinking about it as a sketch artist, somebody with a sketch pad, and you want to sketch the person, you want to put a few lines in, and then you want to turn it around and show the person to say, does that look like you? And you want the person to say, yeah, it does look like me. You want everybody in the room to say, yeah, that looks like him. Yeah, that's cool. You did a good job. And that was really how I felt, that I had to build a portrait of some of these people pretty quickly, but also have them recognize themselves and have other people recognize them. And that is as challenging as anything else. And to a certain extent, I cared about that more than I cared about the people who obviously or ultimately weren't treated as well. Yeah. Or not treated, but didn't come off as well.
I think you nailed it. They all came off like specifically how, not even how you intentioned, just how they came out in the story. Like you said, you didn't specifically say he was a jerk or this guy was doing this. It was just like the situation, and you kind of read into the circumstances and the situation and how they responded to things, and you just get that feel from the conversation like you would in real life. So I thought that was like a really
thank
part
you.
of the book and the story in which you did.
That was by design. I wanted that to happen. So glad it did.
It worked. And I guess the last thing is, when are we going to get some adaptations of this? Because it's perfect for a movie, TV, something.
In the last few weeks, I've been hearing that a lot from people in the business. Nobody's actually said, let's do it, but it's come up. Maybe it will. I mean, it's interesting that you bring it up. When I wrote it, I thought, nobody's going to want to make anything out of this, which didn't bother me so much. I was glad I made a book out of it. But I'm sure going to keep my options open. And also, I will say that, it's coming out as an audio book at some point too. Okay. So that'll be fun. But yeah, I'd love to see it as, go on to movies or specials. Next year is the 30th anniversary of Comedy Central, and that should be a big year for them. And maybe it'll fit into that somehow.
Yeah, so maybe Comedy Central will get turned into a series. After reading it, make for a great series, a great movie, whatever.
Thanks for saying that. Thank you.
And I guess if it does become adapted, who would you want to play you?
I had not thought about it. I got no idea. Honestly, somebody said Ryan Gosling. I thought
Ryan Gosling.
I guess you want somebody as handsome as charismatic as possible. So I have no idea. I'm sure it'll be, if it gets made, it'll be some unknown who will go on to greatness, but we'll see what happens.